Welcome to Mastering Midlife. If you're in your 40s and 50s and asking yourself, what happened? You're driven to succeed but concerned about the effects in your work, career and relationships. You're worried for a close friend or family member you suspect may be close to burnout. Then this podcast is for you. Your host, top-selling author and executive coach Mark J. Silverman has direct and meaningful conversations with world-leading experts in business, finance, health and well-being. Midlife is a time of extraordinary changes and challenges, but you can excel in your career while improving and strengthening your life to achieve sustainable and true success without compromise. Now here's your host, Mark J. Silverman.
So welcome to the first official episode of the Mastering Midlife Podcast. And for my first guest, I brought in my friend, my colleague, and the guy who broke my podcast cherry, Tripp Lanier, the host of the New Man Podcast. Somewhere between the macho jerk and the new age wimp, which is why I asked him, because I knew one.
It's beyond the macho. We don't want to be either one of those things. We don't want to have any. Yeah, we got to go beyond that, not in between.
So the reason I asked Tripp to be the first person to be on this podcast is, one, my admiration for him, and he'll stick his tongue out at that, but just of who he is and how he conducts himself in the world, but also the journey. Tripp has interviewed some of the most famous people on the planet. Every book I have ever read, from Tim Ferriss to Ryan Holiday to Dan Millman, The Way of the Peaceful Warrior, and he's been able to alchemize all that wisdom and new age, if you will, information and spirituality, and I have air quotes here, into actually a real life. And when you listen to his interviews and his conversations with regular people, you'll see that he takes the wisdom that he learns from these people and translates it into boots on the ground, useful information, messages, and action items for the people who listen to his podcast. The second reason is because I find Tripp to be kind of a rock and roll badass in the self-help world. He gets to be himself. I watch how people respond to him. I watch how he surfs and he plays music, and he has his edge that he's never lost. And I see when a lot of men and women grow, once they become successful and they start to find these new ways of growing and changing, they start to lose that edge and they start to move into something that I think is a little less than authentic. So I wanted to really talk about how do you move through the rock and roll of, I was a tech sales guy. I had somewhat of a rock and roll life, if not a rock and roll personality. How do you move that into this next stage of middle age when you have children, you have a relationship who no longer will stand for that kind of behavior? How do you move there and keep your edge? So those are the things I want to talk to Tripp about today. So Tripp, okay. Thank you for being on this podcast.
Thank you, Mark. I'm honored and to be the first guy on the podcast, but I've loved watching your progress over the years. So it's just really cool to see you leaning out. It's one of those things people can always talk about doing something, and I see you doing it. So that always turns me on.
I appreciate that. So in our first conversation, I actually asked you to have a conversation as I started writing the book to help define this middle age challenge for people. For you, what would you call? You're in your 40s. I hate to reveal that.
That's not a problem.
What would you see as when the transition from what your youth was to when, oh shit, things are changing?
Well, I think the big core, like the whole thing, really just boils down to self-image. What's the story that I tell myself about myself? What's the story that I want the world to tell about me? And I think that if we're in a defensive position, meaning we've got to hide and we've got to make sure nobody pokes holes at us or comes at us for something, then life's just really exhausting to be in that defensive position. We're moving away from what we don't want instead of moving towards what we do want. And so the places where I get hung up, the places where my clients are hung up, it isn't usually because they don't have the resources or they don't have the knowledge to do something. It's because they're struggling in this self-image thing. Like, I can't go down that road because people will think this of me, or I may look weak, or I may look ineffective, or whatever that thing is, some kind of element that they've been defending their entire lives. It just comes down to that. And so for some people, middle age is no big deal. And then for others, it might be death. It might feel like death. I'm no longer in my youth. And what does that mean? I won't be attractive. I won't be loved. I won't be, whatever that is. So I think if you just look at it through the lens, that's what I do, is just, it's another thing. It's just another thing that can impact our self-image. And like I said, it might be a big deal for some, and for another guy, it might be that he doesn't live in a certain neighborhood. That could feel like death for him. That's another life transition. So I don't get hung up too much on the midlife aspect of it. I get more curious about, what does this mean to him? What does midlife mean to him? Because I remember I started my first company when I was 22, had no idea what I was doing. I was terrified people would know that I was young and didn't know what I was doing. And then for some reason I had a construct in my head that once I turn 27, I can tell people how old I am. And I remember on my 27th birthday, I had this relief of like, cool, I can tell people I'm 27 and I won't lose my clients now. So it's just these constructs in my head. I was never going to lose my clients because my clients love the work that I did. This was back when I owned a media production company. So I think we just see these ages and stuff as that construct in our mind. We attach a meaning to it.
So you just define middle age for me is for me it can happen at 18, 25, 60. It's when what was working, and often it's that scaffolding that we're putting together to, as you said, to defend the self, or to live out the motivations and the drives that were instilled in us when we were kids, and we don't even know that that's pushing us to be a success.
And I think we feel threatened at middle age because there's a construct that says, well, once I reach this point in my life, I will have figured this out. I will have gotten this handled. I will have accomplished this and this and that. And then middle age comes along, whatever that means. And we go, uh-oh, this construct in my mind isn't lining up with reality. And that can create a crisis.
Was there a line that happened for you?
Oh, I went through a phase in my 30s. I think more of that happened in my 30s when I let go. I outgrew this life that I had where I had created a business and was making good money, and I was a musician and I traveled around and doing that. And then I went into much more of a domestic life that was just the next phase of my life. It was the next phase of my growth. But so I felt compelled to move towards that, but there was definitely a part of my identity. It was like, screw this. Like, no, I am not going down this road. This is death. And I dealt with depression. I dealt with like a lot of just like stuffed up anger. And I had to work through that stuff. That happened more in my 30s, but I think it was definitely what some would call a midlife crisis. But that form of what looks like, I'll call it domestication, because there was a bit of a I do what I want when I want aspect of life. And then there was I actually want to create my life with somebody, and I want to create a business in service of something bigger than myself. Well, that didn't jive so well with the part of me that just wanted to be all me all the time.
Did you have when that started to happen, did you already have tools in your pocket to deal with, depression is showing up, rebellion is showing up, defending that self is showing up? Did you already know?
Well, first part, I wasn't even aware that was happening, because I was so willing and wanting to move into this next phase of my life. I wasn't being dragged into it. Right. So, I had created my life in order to move into this. I was sick of living the way that I was living. I'd had a crisis of like, I'm done and I don't know what else to do. Why can't I be happy anymore? I had gone through a lot of that. And then it was like, yes, I want to move into this way of living with more alignment in I'm choosing a woman to be with me because we're peers and colleagues and I love her and we support each other, instead of she looks great naked. Right. So there were these aspects where there's just a lot more of alignment there. And so I was ready to move forward. I wasn't aware. Like I did equine therapy. That's where you go in a pen with a horse.
Can't hide with the horse.
Dewey Freeman. Dewey Freeman. I walk in, I get in the pen. This massive horse does this thing. The ears go back, all this kind of stuff. And Dewey just looks at me and goes, "What are you so pissed off about?" And I was like, "I'm not fucking pissed off. I'm fine." So I was unaware. I was just completely unaware that this part of me had been disowned. And I think that's the first aspect of just like, well, there's nothing wrong. I just can't figure out why something doesn't feel right.
And what'd you find out?
That I had disowned the parts of me that were a threat to the new life that I was building. I had disowned and pushed those away and minimized their value in my life. So they had gone from being forefront to being more shadow type elements. And that wasn't okay. And I thought, I was already in men's groups and already doing all of this stuff. And I was like, the idea was that it wasn't happening. And it was happening.
You illustrate what I see happen is people who have lived, the typical lifestyle of the 20s and 30s, pre-kids, pre-committed relationship. They do a 180 and they jump in with both feet. And you ever see the Progressive commercial where, if you use Progressive for car insurance, you don't have to turn into your parents.
Uh-huh.
And I watch mostly men turn into this domesticated version of themselves and just push down every semblance of their masculinity, of their wildness, of their edge.
Yeah.
And then it starts to come out 10 years down the road after the kids are already here.
Well, it's coming out in porn. It's coming out in reckless, there's side door things that guys are doing and they don't even realize that that's what's happening. But you're exactly right. There's places where we're going to find an avenue to express that stuff, or we're just going to be pissed off and not understand why we secretly hate our wives and our lives in general. And we want to blow it up.
So what do you tell people when you see those cracks starting to happen and they're not even noticing that's what it is? What do you tell people?
Oh, what do I tell people?
Or ask them?
I need a more specific scenario, but I think what usually comes up, if I'm in a conversation with these guys, they're aware that something's off, and they've already created a duality in their mind, which is I either continue going down this road the way that things are, I'm on this trajectory, and I'm not happy. I'm going to continue to abuse porn or alcohol or TV or food or whatever. I'm going to have affairs. And
as long as the Facebook page looks good.
What does that mean?
It means that their life outwardly looks good.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So they see that trajectory and they're going to maintain that trajectory and know that sucks. Or they imagine that the other side is somehow completely blowing everything up. So of course they're going to grind to a halt. That's if those are their two options. And the key here is to transcend and include the best of both, right? So for me, it was, hey, I really like my wild man. I really like being irreverent. I've always been this way. It's not just me being a little shit all the time. Like, it's just naturally part of who I am, to find the humor and the play, and let's not take life so seriously. So if I disintegrate that stuff, I lose an aspect of who I am in essence. And so it's just about coming back and saying, you know what, can I accept these parts of myself, and can I reintegrate them, and what might that look like? And then it's like, oh, that's what you called it, boots on the ground. But that's like, well, I don't know if my wife would accept that. I don't know if my coworkers would accept that. It starts to endanger those things, and that's where we can start to play and say, well, let's see, let's find little ways to do this, and then let's also find ways for you to reintegrate this wild man. Like, I was talking to a client yesterday. For him, just being wild, he's got 2 young kids, and he and his wife are struggling to get their business going. Just going on a mountain bike ride on a Saturday morning is creating a crisis in his house. His wife is like, I can't take anymore. You can't take that time away, and we can't spend the money on a mountain bike. Like, everything's come to that halt, and they really think that health is going to come from stuffing that aspect of himself any more, and that his freedom is going to come on the other, and his aliveness is going to come on the other side of his kids giving him permission, his wife giving him permission, and his business giving him permission. So that's where we just have to confront this idea. Is it really true that my freedom and my aliveness are a threat to the things that I care about, that bring me peace and stability and love?
So a man is listening to this podcast right now, and he wants to go stand-up paddleboarding or mountain biking or golfing on the weekend, or he wants to have even go to his. I have guys in my men's group on Tuesday nights who their wives are not happy with them being out on Tuesday nights, even though that makes them better husbands, better fathers, and more stand-up guys. What advice would you give that guy who's listening now saying, I can't get any breathing space?
I think you got to look at why you've chosen to have the relationships in your life and why you've chosen to have the careers or everything. Because if those things, I'll just call them things, right? If we choose to have them in our lives and they're not aligned with supporting our greater sense of freedom and aliveness and peace and love, we have to challenge that, right? We have to challenge that, because most of the time we choose our relationships and our careers based on what's going to help me avoid discomfort, what's going to help me avoid risk, and what's going to help me make sure I don't look like a moron. We're playing defense in our lives. So we end up making some pretty shitty choices in order to just get by, right? We can only hope to have relief from those things, but they will not provide us what we ultimately want, which is that sense of freedom and that sense of aliveness and that sense of peace and that sense of love. So what we feel is that boundary. Okay, now I've got a family. Now I have this career, but now I'm unable to actually experience the freedom and aliveness and the peace and the love that I want. I have relief from discomfort. I have relief from this sense of uncertainty and risk and all that kind of stuff. And I have relief from looking stupid. Hey, look, my Facebook looks good, but I don't have that freedom, aliveness, and peace and love. And so we have to look at our choices and say, well, why am I choosing this stuff if it's not in alignment, it's not supporting me, it's not empowering me to have these experiences? And I think that's where we sit down with our partners and say, we've got to talk. We got something to talk about here. I want more out of this life than just being comfortable and just avoiding risk. And my job, and I don't want my job in this relationship to make sure that you feel comfortable all the time. Period. It's got to come down to that. And I that was a big reason why Alice and I work along, is because we realize our job is not to make the other person comfortable or happy. We're here to support one another in the freedom, aliveness, peace, and love. And that might mean things get bumpy. There's times where I'm pissed off because she's doing X, Y, Z, but I have a deeper commitment. Like, oh, this is why we're together. Is because this is where she's expanding into that freedom, aliveness, and peace and love, and vice versa. So it's a lot easier to let that roll off my back when I understand why we're together, instead of, hey, you're making me uncomfortable. Stop
so that's an agreement you and your wife have made to a bigger vision of your relationship.
It's the whole context for the relationship.
So going back to the men and women who don't have that vision yet, what I notice is that there's three choices in this situation. The one choice is the one they've been making, which is stuffing themselves down and letting it come out sideways and in the dark. There's the other part where I can't take it anymore and they blow it up. And the real hard part is to say, I need to set this boundary. I need to have this difficult conversation, and I need to deal with the consequences of rocking the boat.
It's just a time to redefine, right? If you think about it, it's an uncomfortable conversation. Okay, we've had a great run. Now here we are, we're 45, 46, or we're 32, or whatever it might be. Let's sit down and talk about what would have us excited to choose one another from here on out. Because I wouldn't be excited to choose you if it meant that I've got to cut off aspects of myself. If I'm unable to express myself the way that I am. I don't want to be in a relationship where I feel caged and I feel drained because I got to tolerate stuff. So it doesn't have to be so much about playing defense. It's like, what would have us excited to be together be with each other, right? And that might mean that it's uncomfortable from time to time. It might mean that there's greater uncertainty from time to time. It might mean that we don't get it right from time to time. And that's the trade. Am I willing to let go of some of this false sense of security and the false sense of certainty and the false sense of, look how together I've got it, in service of the opportunity to feel more free, alive, and peace and love? And some people will choose that. Not everybody. Some people are just wanting to stay in that false kind of secure comfort bubble. But I think that's the choice. And I think that's where a third party would come in and help them navigate that conversation. Okay, what's our relationship really in service of now, beyond just paying the bills and making sure the kids get to school?
I'm an advocate for everybody to get a referee, a third party, before, during, and periodically during the relationship, to reset and to have those conversations that might be difficult to have on our own.
Yeah. And a lot, especially because we just grow. Like, why would we expect that the person we were when we made that commitment in our 30s or 20s, even teens for some people, like somehow that agreement wouldn't change and morph as we get older and say, okay, well, what would we do now to make sure that this relationship is continuing to serve both of us, not limit us, right? So, and that's where that's a difficult conversation, and it's not the convention. It's not the norm. A lot of people just want set it and forget it. They don't want to think about this stuff. There's guys that you mentioned earlier in the conversation, which is like they turn into their parents. They want to do that. They want to go on autopilot. They watch dad. Great. I get to be dad now. I know what to do. I don't have to think about shit anymore. I can just roll along through life. And so people want to do that. But if we're going to, the things that we want, freedom, aliveness, peace, and love, that requires us to be present and course correct and steer and, what are we going to do here? I've got to make an effort. I've got to think about this. No, people don't want to do that shit.
So what's the first? So you have someone in your office or on the phone, and what's the first step you offer them when you define this, when you see this is happening and it's time to do something? What's the first step you give them?
The first step is to detach your identity from that construct. Who are you if you're not a husband? Who are you if you're not an employee? Or who are you if you're not an entrepreneur? What are we really playing for? Because a lot of us are putting those things first, those constructs first, and then we cram our life into them. I work the other way around, which is we have these constructs in our life to support us. They are the wind at our back. They're empowering us. The relationship I'm in empowers me to have greater freedom, aliveness, peace, and love. The career I have empowers me to have greater freedom, aliveness, peace, and love. The reason why I chose to be a father is to have more freedom, aliveness, peace, and love. It's not the freedom and all. There's definitely aliveness. There's a freedom. Oh, I don't know. There's aliveness. I wonder where my child gets all her energy. And I'm like, oh, she took it from me, little vampire. So, but that's it. It's so when we understand like who I am without these constructs, then I can make a choice of why I would want to have them in my life. And that may mean I got to come back and think about, okay, well, who am I? Who am I really? What am I wanting really? Oh, this is why I would create a relationship in service of that. And that could be really freaking scary if we're back to self-image. Like, oh shit, who am I without these things? Who am I? I don't want to threaten these things. But I think if we were to look long-term, we're playing a long game. Then a few months of kind of a little uncertainty here and there to keep things on track and to keep things moving and open and fluid just really sounds worth it to me. That's my opinion.
One of your past guests is famous for saying everything you want is on the other side of a difficult conversation.
Yeah, a sweaty 5-minute conversation. Yeah,
and it 9 times out of 10 it works out in glorious fashion. That it's the one time that we're afraid of that we'll get rejected or something won't work.
Here's the big mistake. So I was coaching a guy recently. He was scared to get married. He's like 6 months out. And he's like, I don't know if this is the right thing. He's going back and forth and back and forth. And his thing was coming down to sex. He was worried about limiting himself sexually. And so I just said, well, what's the thing you're afraid you're giving up? Right. And he's like, oh, there's just the excitement of meeting something new and, that feeling of being desired and that kind of uncertainty and that there's just a real thing there. And I was like, so this feels like aliveness, right? He's like, yeah, it's aliveness, right? So the idea is that if you were to get married, that somehow you're closing the door on aliveness and adventure, right? Yeah, that's my fear, right? Okay, and then there's this. It's nice that the ego feels good when a woman says, yes, I choose you and you can penetrate me. That's a nice validating piece. Okay, yeah, I don't want to give that up, right? So I just allowed him to express it. The construct in his mind that he wanted was a harem. He actually said that, I want a harem. And he's like, there's no freaking way I can bring that to my fiance that I want a harem. I was like, absolutely, right? That would, you could bring it to her. She's just going to flip out.
Deal breaker.
I said, what's the harem represent to you though? And for him, it was freedom. For him, it was aliveness. For him, it was greater opportunity. And I was like, do you think your fiance wants to give up her sense of freedom and her sense of aliveness and her sense of opportunity as well? Like, this is where we can start to see where it's not the construct, the harem. We both want to feel more alive. We both want to feel more free. So let's sit down and talk about how we can co-create that together and be in service of that of one another. And that's where we find that common ground. It's not about the harem. It's not about, I want to have sex with that waitress. Yes, of course, you may want to have sex with the waitress, but a lot of times it's, I want the experience of that aliveness. And then we can find other ways to go and create that aliveness in the world. And it doesn't have to mean I've got to choose between the waitress and my wife.
Got it.
Does that help?
That helps tremendously. And everything that we're talking about for me always comes back to the choice between blowing things up because we have the energy and the anger and we get so pissed off and bottled up that we blow things up.
Yeah.
And actually getting it a few steps before that. You're talking about at the beginning, if you're lucky enough to do that. What I see often is we didn't set that vision. We didn't set that context. Now we're stuck. Now we're committed. Now we have responsibilities. Now I have to stay in this job because we have a certain lifestyle. We live in a certain place. Now, how do I get my knees and elbows out of here without exploding, without breaking things down, without blowing everything up? And that's the shift. So the conversation that you're saying to have, if you didn't have it at the beginning, if you don't have that shared vision, those sweaty palms and approaching it in some fashion saying, I want this, I still want this, but I want it differently. Can we talk about that?
Yeah. And understanding that your partner, beyond just feeling safe and comfortable, still wants to feel free and alive and at peace and love too, right? It's recognizing that that person doesn't not want those things. It's just that we fear that we're going to give up our sense of security and our sense of comfort, which is what has us play defense. So we can have lots of comforts, we can have lots of, quote, security, but we'll be miserable, right? And I think if we just come back to and say, I know deep down my partner wants this too, beyond being safe, beyond being comfortable, we both want the same things. It's just how we go about it is going to be different. But you're right, it doesn't have to happen at the front. And I wouldn't use that as an excuse because it's today. You chose to be in the relationship. You got up this morning. You didn't pack up your shit and drive out of town. You chose to stay. You chose to stay in it. So every day is a choice. So you have this choice today to say, you know what? I want to talk about this. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about why we continue to choose to be with one another every day instead of play the victim. Be like, I'm stuck. I can't do anything about it.
So is it your experience that on the other side of these conversations and in support of this vision, that there's a greater intimacy and a greater joy and greater freedom than one would think on the other side of this in the way you live your life?
I think what you'll find is greater alignment. Meaning, I know I don't want to be with this person anymore because we're not on the same page. This person and I are not on the same page in terms of our values. This person and I, we don't share the same philosophy. Why would I want to create a life with them? We're just going to get in each other's way. So I think if you start to look that we're no longer playing defense to keep a construct together, we have a construct in there to serve greater love, then we could be like, okay, this is why I would choose to be in this relationship, not just to keep it together. It becomes a trap. It becomes a box at that point. But if I'm really going to have greater love in my life and we're struggling, I don't want to be in this person's way, and I don't want them in my way either. Does that make sense?
It does. It was a little bit different than the question I was asking, but it
okay. Ask your question again.
But it begs to, sometimes we're going to have this conversation and find out that we're not aligned and we need to go in separate directions.
So to answer your question, I think it is greater intimacy. Where you're like, yeah, we're not playing defense anymore. We're not just trying to protect something. We're actually like, hey, I love you enough to get out of the way.
It's beautiful. And, it's a future episode of this podcast is going to be me and my ex-wife having a conversation about how to have a joyful and loving divorce.
Yeah.
And we are now to the point where we are more intimate as friends and as co-parents than we ever could be married. Because we've been able to have these conversations and not getting in each other's way and absolutely support each other. So it's been kind of brilliant in that fashion also.
That is awesome. And to me, that is greater intimacy. That is greater love. It just may not look like what you think it's supposed to look like, which is two people in the same house, sleeping in the same bed, and going on a date on every Friday night.
I know people who actually have made the decision to live in separate houses near each other and stay together.
Yeah. My wife snores loud enough where I might need to live in a different house. She's going to kill me.
Great. This is a great way to wrap this up. So what final thoughts do you have on this conversation?
I think we're just getting started. Let's keep going.
Thanks for listening to Mastering Midlife. If you enjoyed the show, please leave a rating and review. To hear more from Mark and be the first to find out about new shows, you can subscribe to Mastering Midlife anywhere podcasts are heard and listen on Amazon Alexa by adding this show to your flash briefing. For more resources, to find Mark's best-selling books, and to work with Mark, please visit the website at markjsilverman.com.